Welcome to Crime Beat. I'm Anthony Robart. In tonight's story, we bring you a different kind of crime, a case involving death, but according to the law, it's not considered murder, and one in which the weapon was something most of us use every day, with a result none of us would wish for.
First I thought the van had lost control, but when I saw there's no tire tracks or anything, and that's when I realized that it's a very bad impact.
She says, Jen, you need to turn on the television. It's in Vaughan and it involves a van. And I said, well, no.
The whole night I was thinking and I was praying, I was hoping that the kids are gonna make it.
And then I realized they're not gonna wake up. They're not gonna wake up.
The initial officer that had gone to deal with the driver had noticed indicia of impairments.
A 29-year-old man from King has been charged with 18 charges in total in relation to his driving.
So from a legal perspective, in terms of intent, there is a big difference between impaired driving and homicide.
If you're getting behind the wheel of a car drunk, how is that different than picking up a gun that you don't know if it's loaded or not, and you just decide to point it at people?
I don't think we treat impaired driving truly as a crime.
Here now is Karen Lieberman with In an Instant, the Neville-Lake tragedy.
They had gone to church and now we're going for a walk. And they'd be home by 3:30. Started laundry, pulled out mending for some of the new baby stuff. And I sat outside and, darned up some socks and stuff. Chatted with one of my girlfriends and just sort of waited.
3:30 came and went.
I started calling around 4:30 and I didn't get an answer. And then after 5, just before 5, I can't remember the times exactly, I called our friend and I said, did they by any chance go there first? Because they're late. And she said, no. I said, well, if you see them, tell them, hurry up, kind of thing.
Jennifer Neville-Lake and her husband Ed had just celebrated their upcoming 10th wedding anniversary with a date night. Their 3 children slept over at Jennifer's parents' house in King City, north of Toronto.
We had watched Romeo and Juliet, the Leonardo DiCaprio, Claire Danes version when we came back, and he was shaking his head because he agreed to watch Shakespeare. And he's like, can this count as your anniversary present? And I said, yeah, it can count. It's for your 10th wedding anniversary, it's something metal. And so we got the established 2005, and then it says Edward and Jennifer better together when you connect the pieces. So they had called me on Sunday and said the pieces were ready.
Well, I was coming home and I was driving in this road. As you can see, the slopes up and down. I was just enjoying my ride. As soon as I arrived at the Kirby and Kipling, just about 50 meters before, I noticed there's a couple of cars on the side of the road. They've pulled over.
It was a Sunday afternoon in late September.
The traffic is normally at that time, it was not that bad. It was quite slow and not a lot of residents in the area.
As Zabi Akbari slowed to a stop a few hundred meters from his home, he had no idea what he was about to see.
At that moment, was only three other people were in the scene.
At home, Jennifer waited for word from her parents. They were driving the children back in the family's brand new black Dodge Grand Caravan, and they were late.
And I was a little annoyed because my mom had been saying, so she was scheduled to go down and speak at U of T for a couple of days. And the lady that was coming on the trip with us, a very good friend of my parents, my mom had said, well, maybe we'll go by her house first and show her the new vehicle. And then drop my mom off.
I saw a van across the ditch and a SUV, a Jeep, was standing in the middle of the road with a gentleman very upset in front of it. So right away I pulled over and got out of my car and I reached out to him. And I said, "Sir, are you okay?" And he was holding his face and he said, "Who cares about me? There's kids in the van. See what you can do." First I thought the van had lost control, but when I saw there's no tire tracks or anything, and that's when I realized that it's a very bad impact, that's launched the van across the ditch. I run, I jump across the ditch, and as soon as I saw the van, it was something that I'd never experienced before. And the kids were, there was 2 ladies in the front seat and 2 kids in the middle seat behind the driver and passenger, and a gentleman in the back. So just like anybody would do, I was trying to call everybody if everybody was okay, if I could do something. The 2 ladies in the front, I think they were okay, but the rest, everybody was just, they were out. Right away I grabbed my phone and I called 911. And I was panicking. At that moment I was like very upset, and I'm trying to get their attention to make sure that they send the helicopter. The lady at the dispatch, she was trying to keep me calm. And she said, "What do you see there?" I said, "I see," so I told her exactly what I was seeing. And I moved away from the van. I didn't have the stomach to stay and watch what I was seeing. And that's when she asked me to go back. And I was hesitant, I didn't want to go back. And she said, "No, you have to. You have to go back because you're the only help I have right now. And you have to do what I tell you to do. So you have to, because these kids, this family needs your help."
The phone rang at the Neville-Lake home.
She says, "Jen, you need to turn on the television. 3 kids and a woman are dead. It's in Vaughan and involves a van." And I said, "Well, that's, no. So I turned on the TV, and it was an aerial shot. And they focused in on the van. And I saw the bag Daniel and I had put in the new van. And I recognized the pattern. I started screaming. A lot of it's a blur after that. I had called Ed at work and then hung up because I'm like, this can't be us, but I think it is. I called my parents frantically again. Someone picked up their phone and cut the call. And then every time I tried to call their phones after that, it went right to voicemail, so I guess they turned them off. So I sat by the phone on the floor in the kitchen, and I just alternated between yelling and waiting.
Jennifer waited for Ed to get home. Desperate for information, she logged on to Facebook.
I said, "Please somebody tell me what's happening at this place." Because by this point, it turned the TV off. I didn't want to hear it, but I needed to know what was happening. I needed to see it again, but I couldn't turn it back on. Ed comes home. In the meantime, I've called my friend Age, and I'm like, "Age, I think it's us."
She's like, "There's a car crash." And I'm like, "What?" And I'm like, "Who? You?" Like, I assumed, like, and she's like, "No." She's like, I'm pretty sure it was my parents and the kids. And she was just freaking out on the phone. And it just, everything kind of crumbled. Because, like, there was so, like, everything was up in the air. There was no details, there was no, and, like, you know, panicking and fearing for the worst. And then to see that that's what happened was just devastating.
Welcome back to Crime Beat. There's been a car crash involving 7 people, 6 of them family members traveling together in a van. And as Jennifer Neville-Lake and her husband Ed face a horror of uncertain proportions, the other driver learns that some actions can never be undone. We now return to Karen Lieberman and, in an instant, the Neville-Lake tragedy.
It's 3:15 in the afternoon on a clear fall day when 29-year-old Marco Muzzo arrives at Toronto's International Airport from Miami.
He was celebrating his bachelor party over the weekend. They arrived back in Toronto. It was a privately owned plane by his family, their business. Upon landing, he deplanes, gets in his Jeep and headed home to his new home and took a shortcut through that area.
It's around 4 o'clock as he gets to the intersection of Kipling Avenue and Kirby Road.
We know that the Jeep is going northbound, traveling towards the stop sign controlled intersection, and unfortunately doesn't stop for the stop sign. We know that our Caravan, or Dodge, is traveling westbound, and as it approaches the intersection, it gets T-boned essentially. The van ends up into the ditch, and our Jeep stays on the roadway. The impact was pretty much driver's side complete side. He hit pretty well like a T-bone, dead center. That whole area is crumpled in. There's damage to the frame, there's damage to the doors. There's obviously crumpling throughout the body itself. There was severe damage to that. So the front end of that vehicle was totaled. Like, it was all crushed backwards.
I've been living in that area for 5 years. I used to see this all the time, people speeding and people driving very careless. I was just trying to figure out what did he do to cause this? What was he thinking?
Describe him.
He was, I think, about 29, 30 years old, something like that. Not shaved completely. And also he looked a little bit tired, but at that moment, very angry. He was slapping himself in the face. He used the swear language and he's like, who cares about me? There's kids in the car. Please, please, I beg you, do something for the kids. Everybody was staying away from him, kind of. Everybody was starting to get angry because everybody started to realize when I was talking to the dispatch about the condition of the kids, people were getting very upset. And then when I came back on the road, as soon as when the firefighters arrived and ambulance arrived, I saw a police officer putting him behind a police cruiser.
The initial officer that had gone to deal with the driver had noticed indicias of impairment. So normally whenever a person has been drinking and they are impaired or drunk, you're going to be able to notice some of the signs. You'll sometimes see glossy eyes or redness around the eyes. You're going to be able to smell the breath, the alcohol in the breath. Their fine motor skills are usually going to deteriorate, and sometimes even your gross motor skills. You're sometimes going to get that little bit of a sway. They're going to be unsteady on their feet. And some of these signs are what the officer that made the arrest had seen.
A 29-year-old man from King has been charged with 18 charges in total in relation to his driving.
The driver, Marco Muzzo of King City, arrested on the spot, now facing a litany of impaired driving charges.
I was shocked because he didn't look anything like he was drunk at all. He was just standing and just like everybody else. The whole night I was thinking and I was praying, I was hoping that the kids are going to make it.
As the family is transported to hospital, officers contact Jennifer and Ed.
They brought us to the police station. They slammed my hand down on the counter. There were 3 officers. They were talking kind of in the back. And so one of them came to me. I was rude, very rude. He said, tell me, I need to know the van that's on the news. And I gave the number plate. Are these people inside? And I handed them that photo that's behind me. when we took a fun day at work, this big officer, he said, "Come with me." And we went into a room, and just right before I walked in, he said, "I'm so sorry." And Ed and I are in there. I'd never seen him look like that. He was all sorts of shades of purple and red, and he looked like he was gonna explode.
Jen's father, Gary, and Daniel were rushed to a different hospital. And so we were getting updates about Harrison and Milagros, and there wasn't very many updates about Gary and Daniel at the time. And so it was really difficult because, like, we didn't know.
Sadly, one of the occupants of the vehicle, a 65-year-old man, suffered life-threatening injuries and died here at the scene. And then from there, a series of people were taken to hospital. There were 3 young children, all under the age of 10, that were taken to hospital suffering from life-threatening injuries. Very sadly, one of the children, a 9-year-old boy, has succumbed to those injuries in hospital.
"Where are the kids? Where are my kids?" They told me that Daniel and my dad were dead, and that Harry and Millie have been transferred to St. Kitts, and we're fighting. And then the woman, she handed me the phone, and it was St. Kitts, and they said we need consent for surgery, blah blah blah, you know. And I said, "Which one is in surgery? Which one? Which of my babies is in surgery?"
I knew very early on that she wanted to get married and have a family, a big family if possible. She met Edward, yeah, and I mean that fulfilled part of her dream, right? To get married, to settle down, and to have this cozy little life together.
I didn't think I was gonna get married. I didn't think I was gonna have a family. So for me, it was like, I really enjoyed spending the time with their family because I felt like I was a part of it.
Old friends Adriana Raqueta and Bianca Pedro both had a special relationship with the oldest boy, Daniel.
Jen would often come visit me with him, and he grew up calling me Tita Bia, which essentially means aunt. We're there in July of 2015 at Harry's birthday party, just a couple of short months prior to the crash. I really got to see little peeks of their personalities, and especially Millie, when I could totally see her being like a miniature Jen at that point. She was just so sassy and independent, very mischievous, and I just thought, oh my gosh, this is little Jen.
When Daniel was learning to speak, for some reason the A sound, because they would always call me Age, which is my nickname, the A sound was kind of difficult for him. So he had started calling me Beige. For some reason that B showed up. When Daniel was old enough to talk, and then as Harrison and Milagros started speaking, as I'd approach the front door, I could hear the kids, "Beige is here, Beige is here, hide, hide, Beige is here, Beige is here." And I know where they were because I could hear them, but it was just, you know, opening the door and having them jump out to shock me and surprise me. It felt like the warmest welcome I could have.
And what was Jen like as a mom to these kids?
Oh, I mean, she was super loving and attentive, and just always wanting to give the world to them. I think the dream was to keep going, to keep building this family with beautiful, smart children.
Growing, yeah. You know, finding out I was pregnant again, that was something Ed and I had discussed, 3 or 4 kids when we came together, got married. We weren't sure if we wanted 3 or if we wanted 4, and then after Millie, we're like, no, we definitely want 1 more.
But the joy of a 4th pregnancy was shattered.
The doctor was ready down the hall because I was running down the hall. I think he wanted to tell me something before I walked in, but I ignored it. Millie was on my left, and Harry was on my right. They were so quiet. So quiet. The only sound in the room was the machines working. And there's nurses that are doing their best, and they're crying. And then I realized they're not gonna wake up. They're not gonna wake up. So I said to Ed, we have to say goodbye. The doctor asked me whose life support to turn off first. And I said, can they die together? Ed and I crawled into bed with them. He was beside Harry, I was beside Millie. And I asked everyone to sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow to them. The police found us, and they had news. And that's when I found out that it was a drunk driver, an alleged drunk driver had hit my kids. And when they put pictures up of him, I was like, I know him. I know him.
How did you recognize him?
Because he lived 19 houses away from my parents, around the corner from them. He wasn't there long, but everyone in town knew him.
Was the name familiar to you?
Not really. I mean, it was the face.
The family, the Muzzos, own a construction empire in Vaughan worth more than $1 billion. The Muzzo estate ranked 52nd out of Canada's top 100 richest this year. Muzzo's fiancée, his mother, and 2 other women attended Newmarket Court to support him. Appearing haggard and in jeans and a t-shirt, he kept his head bowed except to say his name and birth date.
Finding out that the drunk driver was coming from a position of privilege where they could have afforded someone to drive them. That made me even more angry because it's like there's no excuse. There's no excuse at that point.
29-year-old Marco Muzzo is a member of a family well known for decades in Ontario's construction and property development industries. They've made millions building entire neighborhoods, like this one in the beach. In his personal life, he's engaged to be married. Photos on social media show him and his fiancée smiling, happy, at dinner with friends, parties, on vacation. In other photos that have surfaced online, Muzzo is seen wearing red Ferrari gear and sitting in one. Court records show he had 2 speeding tickets, each for about 30 over, both withdrawn though. His lawyer, Rudy Covray, says he's never been in any trouble for his driving.
If he was in this kind of situation before, I'm sure you guys would have known about it, right? So the answer to that is no.
Police spent months tracking Marco Muzzo's actions in the days leading up to the crash. They knew he'd spent the weekend in Miami for his bachelor party and flown home on a private jet.
If it's a public or private place, like in airports, they're renting the facility, we want to look at the information that they can provide us. When did they arrive? Who can we talk to? What other witnesses are they? How much do they have to drink while they're on the premise, whether it's a bar or an airplane? What he ate? When did they take off? What did they have supplies on the plane? Who was on the plane that could maybe talk to us and give us a statement about how his actions were? So yeah, no, that information was very important for this investigation. My job was to start from the beginning, look at all the photos, read all the statements, talk to all the officers involved, read all the officers' notes, and try to gather as much information as I could to be able to tell a story. We can do so much with that data. So when the crash happens, about 5 seconds before that, the airbag control module, it's going to capture a bunch of data. It's going to capture speed, it's going to capture engine RPM, steering wheel angles, whether or not the brakes are activated, and depending on the make and model, it's going to provide tidbits. Sometimes it's oil pressure, sometimes we can get GPS locations, when the doors open or closed, or how fast the car was going, or whether or not they're wearing their seatbelt. There's a lot of information that can be gathered within those systems. That's important because at least we can see what he was doing 5 seconds before the collision. It's also going to provide us with 250 milliseconds post-collision. So for our reconstructionists, that is going to provide us with the evidence about what had happened between those two vehicles. Our greatest source of evidence gathering is crowdsourcing. It's dealing with the public, having them come forward, telling us their stories. Or even something simple as 2 or 3 months ago, we saw this guy doing the exact same thing, because that's going to build a pattern.
We start tonight with news about a drunk driver who killed 4 people and has just been released on bail. Marco Muzzo, grandson of a billionaire Ontario developer, pleaded guilty to killing 3 children and their grandfather in a horrific crash.
I stand here before you today with great remorse, sympathy, and unimaginable regret, said Marco Muzzo to a packed courthouse.
I don't want to listen to the man who is responsible for, killing my children. There is nothing he could say. His actions spoke louder than his words.
Through gasps, Marco Muzzo read, "I could never have imagined the degree of suffering and pain I've caused," his voice shaking. The Crown is asking for a 10 to 12-year prison sentence and 8 to 12-year driving ban.
During court proceedings, details of what led to the crash emerged. After a late-night dinner in Miami, Marco Muzzo and a dozen of his friends and relatives stayed up, consuming alcohol until 3 o'clock the next morning, September 27, 2015, the day of the crash. The court ordered a psychiatric evaluation, which was conducted by Dr. Graham Glancy. According to the report, during the flight, he watched some movies. He reports that he had 3 or 4 alcoholic drinks. He felt good and was walking and talking without difficulty. He did not perceive himself as being drunk, Glancy wrote. The agreed statement of facts indicated he drove home with a blood alcohol concentration 2 to 3 times over the legal limit. Muzzo was speeding and blew through a stop sign, slamming his SUV into the Neville-Lake van.
There was indications that the SUV had slowed down. There would have been higher speeds because with the airbag control module, we know 5 seconds prior to the collision. And when it was going through the intersection, that was the slowest speed that had reached when it had come to the point of impact. You have a vehicle that is going straight, and then you have another vehicle that's going straight. So we know that at the time of impact, the strike happened at 85 kilometers an hour. There's a tremendous amount of energy that was displaced there. You're going forward, and then you're getting pushed off to the side. Our bodies aren't made to really handle that kind of movement, especially our internal organs. So that's really going to be cause of one of the big mechanisms of death.
The posted speed limit had been 80 kilometers per hour.
If anyone's been on that road, I mean, it's narrow, it's curvy. Like, I don't see how anyone could ever drive that fast on that road. And I've driven that road many times. And it just shocks me every single time. And I think it will for the rest of my life. I don't know. You never know. I mean, intoxication is one thing, but speed, you combine the two of them and somebody's likely to die.
My mother and my grandmother were in the front seats. They both received head injuries. In the second row, the bench seat was Harry, and Daniel was seated right beside him on the bench. And then behind was Milagros, but right behind Harry, that little space, and then my dad. He was still buckled. They were all buckled. Parts of his vehicle were left in our vehicle. They couldn't extract it. And the back seat had flipped back, and they found Millie underneath my dad.
What was it like seeing the driver in court?
To see those hands that strove right into the side of my car, it was the most horrifically surreal experience.
The judge will sentence Marco Muzzo on March 29th. Until then, he's remanded into custody.
Muzzo had no previous criminal record, but he did have a lengthy history of Highway Traffic Act violations. On 10 occasions, he was found guilty of speeding.
When you choose to drink and drive, you're hurting other families. You're killing someone else's babies, like mine were killed. Like all of mine were killed.
Marco Muzzo took full responsibility for his actions, took full accountability for his actions, and today he fully accepts the sentence that was imposed by Justice First.
Less credit for time served, Muzzo would face 9 years, 4 months behind bars. plus a 12-year driving ban to begin upon release. It was the harshest sentence in Canadian history for an impaired driver without a prior record. Ontario Superior Court Justice Michelle First noted, for as long as Mr. Muzzo has been alive, courts have warned about the consequences of impaired driving. Yet the message escaped him. It is important that it does not escape others.
I'm here because I'm a mother of 3. And I wake up to see my beautiful children every morning. And this has affected me so profoundly. I live in the area, and I wanted the Neville family to know that they're supported.
Automatic suspension for life. I don't care who you are. We're adults. We're not children. We got to take responsibility.
You know the dangers. Like, if you're getting behind the wheel of a car drunk, how is that different than picking up a gun that you don't know if it's loaded or not, and you just decide to point it at people? How is it any different? People take that gamble and they think, oh, well, you know, it's not gonna happen to me. And then it does.
Certainly in our legal system, and I think any system around the world, there is a difference between someone who intentionally takes a life and someone who takes a life through an impaired driving crash, right? People who commit murder, homicide, first or second, whatever you want to call it, their intention is to take this person's life. Now, we can all know that anyone who gets behind the wheel, they've been drinking or smoking marijuana or doing other drugs, that the risk is there that they're going to do that, but their intention is not to do that. They don't ever intend to hurt anybody. So from a legal perspective, in terms of intent, there is a big difference between impaired driving and homicide.
4 lives have been lost. 6 lives physically affected just from the people in the van, not counting Jennifer and Edward and all the other family. And essentially, the sentences being served concurrently would be the equivalent of whether it was 1 person or 4 people that were killed. And it was, in my eyes, it was disappointing because it was like, it's not really fair justice.
We had an offense of criminal negligence causing death and criminal negligence in the operation of a motor vehicle. Our law was changed in 1985 because they couldn't get convictions.
That's when the offense of impaired driving causing death was enacted into the criminal code.
Judges are taking this more seriously. The sentences are increasing. Are they at a level that I believe appropriately reflects the seriousness of the offense? No. And should those sentences be increased? Yes.
But discouraging drinking and driving might be less about the penalty and more about getting caught.
I demand that you provide a sample of your breath into an approved screening device.
All of Western Europe is far, far ahead of us. Great progress has also been recently made in Ireland, also Australia and New Zealand. They actually have a higher rate of per capita alcohol consumption. So they drink more, but we end up with more alcohol-related fatalities. And one of the major reasons for that is that their laws are more effective than our laws.
In 2018, mandatory alcohol screening was enacted across Canada.
If a police officer lawfully stops you in the course of his duties and has an approved screening device with him, he or she may demand that you provide a breath sample without individualized suspicion. What it does is it dramatically increases the perceived risk of apprehension. And in every country in which mandatory alcohol screening has been introduced, there have been substantial and sustained reductions in deaths and injuries.
Just going to do a quick roadside breath test just to make sure you haven't had any alcohol, okay?
Regardless, it's an ongoing problem.
I demand you provide a sample of your breath into an approved screening device to enable a proper analysis of your breath to be made.
How big of an issue is impaired driving right now in New York region?
Ever since I've been a police officer in New York region, it's been a big issue, and that's been almost 15 years now and just continues to be an issue. Okay, so unfortunately you failed.
What?
Okay, so turn around, place your hands behind your back.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're under arrest for impaired driving. You're 80 plus. We seem to be catching as many impaired drivers as officers have time to be able to catch, and to me that just indicates that there's so many more out there, and the numbers are just staggering. How many in any given day or night we find.
The blood alcohol limit is 0.08%.
We failed to convince the federal government to introduce a 0.5 criminal offense, even though the vast majority of other countries around the world have 0.5 or lower. So, is it a good idea? Would it save lives? Yes. Is it likely to be enacted? No.
Muzzo's sentence of 10 years is something Jennifer Neville-Lake can't accept.
The justice system gives a lot of leeway to a first-time offender. The drunk driver who killed my family was a first-time offender technically, which is why his sentence, reverberated through the country, because it's the harshest sentence given to a first-time offender. I don't think that first time, second time, third time should matter. I think they should be all treated with equal weight and consideration, because I don't think we treat impaired driving truly as a crime. And I think we need to look at that piece of it, because I'm not aware of any other crime in Canada, and I'm thinking particularly of homicides. Oh, it was his first time killing someone.
A year and a half into his 10-year sentence, Marco Muzzo began seeking release from prison.
Now we're learning he's just weeks away from being eligible to apply for unescorted temporary absences from prison, a type of conditional release that comes after offenders serve a sixth of their sentence.
The fact that he's been classified or reclassified into a lower security only acknowledges the fact that he's not a traditional criminal.
So what goes through my head? They'll come home, right? Because that's what a sentence end means, is that you get your life back. So when his sentence is over, that means mine ends too, right? That means that I get to be a mom to living kids again. He gets his life back, and I'm still left to serve out all the life sentences he gave me. And it's, the word even life sentences sounds so weird, because it's not life sentences, because they're dead. So it's really their death sentences that I've been given over and over and over.
In November 2018, Muzzo appeared before the Parole Board of Canada, seeking day parole. The board pressed Muzzo on an incident from 2012, one that had not come to light during prior court proceedings.
During the 3-hour parole hearing, it was revealed 32-year-old Marco Muzzo has a history of issues surrounding alcohol. In 2012, he'd been jailed briefly for being drunk in public after he and a friend began fighting a Vaughan strip club bouncer when they were denied entry.
The charges in that incident were eventually dropped. In this case, however, Muzzo was denied parole, but a few years later, he would get a taste of freedom.
After serving just more than 4 years of his 10-year prison sentence, Marco Muzzo has been granted day parole.
When I was writing my statements for the parole board, I used the word killer and I used the word killed. And there was an issue with it, and they said, you can't use the word killer. And I said, why not? And they had said, because killer is usually used for somebody who murders, someone who has murdered someone else. Use the word killer. And I said, okay, well, my children were killed. And so I said, the other term that comes to mind, which we don't recognize in Canada in the court system, is mass murderer. Because mass murderer is defined as someone who kills 4 or more people in a single incident. So I said, is that a better term to use in my parole statements? Because that fits.
Just 5 years after the crash, Marco Muzzo sought full parole. Jennifer and Ed pleaded with the parole board not to grant his request. noting they suffer from anxiety, nightmares, and need help with even the most basic tasks.
Between rehab support work, personal support worker, it's more than just someone checking in on you. I mean, you literally need care on a day-to-day basis.
Lawyer Savannah Chorney represented the family in a civil case against Muzzo and the company he worked for, which owned the SUV he'd been driving while impaired.
It was in excess of $20 million. You've got the criminal case on one side, but on the civil side, punitive damages are meant to punish the wrongdoer as well. The loss of income, future care needs, out-of-pocket expenses, all of these, add up and can be quite significant.
While pointing out Muzzo has work to do in terms of victim empathy, the board granted him full parole in February 2021. By then, the tragedy had become too much for Edward Lake to bear.
Edward's entire life was just ripped away from him. And I know there were times where he would just be wandering aimlessly around the house, wandering aimlessly around the yard. And I'd be like, hey, do you need help with something? And he's like, no. I'm like, what are you doing? And he's like, I don't know. Even though he wasn't a very social person to begin with, he just started going more and more into himself. And that was one of the biggest things that to me was concerning, because I'd spent so much time trying to get him to open up and have him see me as his friend, not just Jen's friend age, right? And it just, everything started reverting. He became a ghost of himself.
He was just broken after the crash. I mean, you could see it any time you met with him, how devastated he was to have had this life taken away from him. How do you move on after something like this?
At sentencing, Edward Lake shared that he'd been suffering through suicidal thoughts and anxiety since the crash that killed his 3 children. He spoke about taking medication for depression.
I feel lost. I feel destroyed. That's what I feel.
7 years after the loss of his children, he took his own life.
My Edward, my children's father, was already gone. His body was here, but his heart was with Daniel. The pieces he shared with our kids were gone. And that's so hard, because nobody else has Millie's smile. That came from Ed. I'm the only one left. Every single one of them, of the family that I created, except for me, is gone because someone chose to drive impaired.
We would all hope, I think, any crash that involves a death or even a serious injury would be a wake-up call to any of us that driving impaired is dangerous and the worst can happen. But a crash that involves the death of 3 young children, that gets the coverage that that case got across the country, internationally, if that doesn't change people's behavior, I don't know what will.
In a Brampton park where the Neville-Lake children once played, there is a monument with their names, and those of more than 100 others killed in impairment-related crashes.
I don't want them to be known as the Neville-Lake kids that were killed by a drunk driver. I would hope that people would see these are eternal children who never get a chance to grow up. So their legacy is one of beauty and one of the wonder that they could have brought to the world, that they should have brought to the world.
Every year in Canada, thousands of people are hurt in impaired driving crashes and hundreds are killed. These injuries and deaths are preventable. The United States passed legislation in 2021 requiring anti-impaired driving technology to be standard equipment in all new vehicles by 2027. Mothers Against Drunk Driving argue similar legislation is needed here in Canada and would prevent the majority of alcohol-impaired driving deaths. As the sole survivor of her family, Jennifer Neville-Lake has made it her mission to keep her loved ones' memories alive. Many Hands Doing Good, the charity honoring Millie, Harry, Daniel, and Gary, provides funding for arts, dance, and music for children up to the age of 9 who've suffered the effects of trauma. I'm Anthony Robart. Thank you for joining us tonight on Crime Beat.
Want more episodes of Crime Beat? Listen to the Crime Beat podcast now for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. And for past episodes of Crime Beat, go to the Global TV app, visit globaltv.com, or check out our Crime Beat YouTube page.